Good evening, everybody. I just wanted to use the gavel. Okay, never used it before, so I thought I'd give it a bit of a go. Okay, my name's Councillor Stuart Frost, and this is the meeting of the Economic Planning and Housing Committee. So I just want to go through a few important bits. There is no fire alarms scheduled for this evening. Therefore, if the fire alarm sounds, please evacuate the building immediately. The fire exit is located at the rear of this room, through here. Go down the stairs and we'll meet in the War Memorial Park. Please note that the meeting is being webcast live on the internet, and the webcast will also be published to YouTube after the meeting. Are we on? We're on. Okay. And can members please also all turn their phones to silent, okay, or off, please. Thank you very much. So, what I'd like to do first is go through apologies for absence and substitutions. Okay, from the Conservative side, Councillor Paul Miller is being replaced by Councillor Graham Faulkner, and the portfolio holder for Planning, Infrastructure and National Environment is being replaced by Leader of the Council, Ken Rattigan, and unfortunately the Executive Director of the Borough Services from the administration, Rebecca Emmett, sends her apologies. Are there any other apologies? Councillor Kaniszko.
Yeah. From the Lib Dem side, Councillor Gavin James sends his apologies.
Thank you very much. Okay, right. Let's crack on. So, if we move on to any declarations of interest, has anybody got a declaration of interest? Okay, apart from the obvious. Okay, it's my understanding, moving on to number 3, that we have no urgent matters tonight unless anybody wishes to raise them. Great. Moving on to number 4, minutes of the meeting held on the 4th of July. Okay, I've read them. Okay, I think they're a pretty fair record. Okay, and I'd like to move that they be signed as a correct record. Can somebody second? Councillor George. Okay. Thank you for seconding. Okay, and I will sign those. Thank you very much. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is to move on to the local plan update, and I'd like to hand over to Councillor Ken Rattigan, who will introduce the paper.
Thank you, Chair, and I'm delighted to be here tonight, as you can imagine. Councillor Raffel can't be here, but you all are aware of my interests in our local plan, my work on DC, and this committee and others within the council have reflected my view that this is a very important piece of work that we do, not only to shape our borough but also to reflect the views of us as councillors, and to lay out the process on which we get a better built borough in many shapes and forms. So my point of being here is to listen to the debate, to try and understand what you as a committee wish for us, to note what is in the debate, but also manage what is going to come forward, and to give you an opportunity to have your say as we move through the process. Adoption of local plans, like all adoptions, are difficult. So I just raise that, but it is important that you understand that we are here to hear your views. Now, obviously, I take you to page 12, where strengthening the place shaping of policies. Well, to my mind, that is almost the most important thing that is on this, and it gives you an opportunity to help us in that journey, to feed into officers your thoughts and processes, and to go back to your friends and colleagues and to the wider public and say, what is it you really want from us? How can we make it a better local plan? And that is no criticism of what we have, because it was a difficult journey on that one, but also to say, what does this borough actually need and what can it want into a future vision? So We have the officers who will be able to help us through that tonight, but the reality is that I wish to hear from you as a committee and work through this together. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Rettigan. I'd like to now hand over to officers and Joanne.
Just to add to what the leader was saying there, as we say, we're very much in listening mode really today. As a first step, really looking at what the scope of the plan should cover. So obviously we've agreed to update the plan in line with our requirements. This is kind of the first step in that. Officers have done an initial review of policies, and as a result of that, so section 3 of the report highlights some areas really to give some focus for the discussions tonight, for things that officers think are probably the key areas. That's not to say that there aren't other areas that could very well be reviewed. We will have to do a detailed review of all the policies. Some will need to be tweaked in light of national guidance updates, for example. But there's obviously opportunities here to pick up on local aspirations and things as well, and to feed that through. I think it's quite important to note up front that we don't have to update all the policies. This is a kind of review and update. A lot of the policies are working very well as they are. You'll know through the AMR discussions that we've had before that many of them are fit for purpose and continue to be so. So we don't have to do a full trawl of everything. That is kind of in our gift to some extent what we update. So that's kind of the context of it. I can run through section 3 if you would find it helpful just quickly, or we can go through it bit by bit. It's up to... Shall I just run through quickly?
I think you could just run through it quickly.
Yeah.
Okay. And then we
So
can crack
just
on.
taking the kind of bullets, well, the numbers are sort of 10 points that officers have raised. The first one is all about housing issues. So obviously the key issue for kind of moving forward with the review is the fact that the housing number is very likely to change in light of the new methodology. So the new plan will need to take account of whatever that number will be moving forward. There will be new allocations as a result of that. The plan will be covering a longer period of time. So because of that, we will need to be looking at allocations. So also types of allocations as well is something that we can look at through this. To date, we've got a number of policies, as you will know, which support different types of allocations for needs. So housing mix policies, self-build, things like that. We can take the opportunity here to be more precise if we want to and have specific allocations for specific needs. So those are sorts of issues we can look at moving forward. Obviously we'll need to review affordable housing provision, whether that's still fit for purpose in terms of tenure and the amount of affordable housing that we're asking for, and to make sure that our policies and strategy are still really effective in light of the AMR information that we've got, whether we need to do anything further. There's also a key aspect there in terms of neighbourhood planning, and some of you around the table will already know that we've gone out and spoken to relevant town and parish councils about the future role of neighbourhood planning, whether we allocate in rural areas, whether we look at numbers, and how that spatial strategy may work. So that's a kind of key area for the local plan moving forward. Same really applies for employment land. Obviously there will be growth, so we'll need to see what that means in terms of the need for new employment land. We will need to do a new employment land review because of that. We can revisit our existing strategy. Obviously we have the strategy that we've had for many years of protecting our employment areas. We can relook at that and how effective that's been, but it will also be considering whether we need new allocations for employment moving forward. Moving on to Basing View, we've got quite a successful policy to date, which has delivered a lot of redevelopment, regeneration. We can review that to see again whether it's fit for purpose, whether we consider it to be too flexible, whether we want it to be more directional in the future. Also, whether the boundary of Basing View should suitably be widened, for example, to include station approach, whether that's a valid thing to look at now or not. Those are the sort of things we can look at as part of the employment aspect, and particularly Basing View. Basingstoke Town Centre, again we have quite a flexible policy at the moment, protecting the vitality and viability of town centres. We may want to add to the clarity of that, again be more directional, have a more of a place shaping focus, for example directing certain uses into certain areas, looking again at the hierarchy, local centres, district centres, whether they're working correctly. So that's something we can look at in terms of town centres. And then the place shaping policies, as the leader already mentioned, Obviously, ensuring that quality development is delivered will be a key aspect of the plan. We already have design policies in there, but we may seek to strengthen those, to split up the existing policies that we have, like EM10, to look at particular issues like materials, layouts, amenity, densities, to look in more detail and strengthen the whole quality issue. We can also look at other tools, so things that we've discussed at this committee before, such as the technical housing standards, space standards, whether we can introduce those, and looking at other things to encourage quality, like as quality marks, things like that. So these are all things that we can consider. Leisure park is probably quite self-explanatory about whether that's still fit for purpose in light of the council's aspirations, whether we want to change that at all. Numbers 7 and 9 are probably linked in that they're about the green aspects of the plan, the biodiversity. National guidance has changed quite a lot since the last plan was adopted on that. It's a lot more of an emphasis on biodiversity net gain, so we need to look at that and anything that comes out of the new environment bill and how we incorporate that. We also can build on the green infrastructure strategy, looking at whether we want to do green space allocations following along what a lot of neighbourhood plans have done, whether we want to go down that line, looking at nature improvement areas, those sorts of things. There's also here the opportunity to pick up the climate change agenda. Obviously that's a key objective already of the plan, but in light of Horizon 2050 and things that have progressed, the climate emergency, whether we want to strengthen the policies that we've got and introduce new, wider policies which look at sustainable design and construction, for example. So there's that aspect. And the last one, number 10, which is not really a policy area, it's more about that would need to be a key aspect of the spatial strategy moving forward and what we consider to be the key aspects of infrastructure provision.
Thank you, Joanne. Right, I think, sorry, Matt, do you have anything to add? Okay, no, okay. Just thought I'd ask just to keep you involved, you know. Okay, I'd like to open the floor for questions to officers. Okay, Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the presentation and the introduction from the leader as well. I appreciate it. Can I ask in terms of number 1, the housing figure number, have you done any calculations? Have you got a ballpark figure from using the methodology and using the evidence base that we have currently as to what you believe it would be and what we would be looking at this moment? Obviously moving into issues and options, if you go around that later this year. We already are in the later of the year, aren't we?
A key message with this is that it's hugely uncertain and it will continue to change through this local plan process as we move forward. So it's something for everyone to kind of grasp, that we really don't know what the figure will be at this stage. Obviously we've got that 850 dwellings per annum figure at the moment. With the new standard methodology, the figure as we currently look at it, if we didn't have a plan in place, would be 955 dwellings per annum. So that's kind of perhaps a ballpark figure for you to be aware of. But this figure will continue to change every year because it's now based on population projections, which are updated every 2 years, and affordability data, which changes every year. So because of that, come next September, we should hopefully have a better understanding of what our figure will be, because the new projections will be published at that point. Until then, we can kind of only speculate what it will be. It's likely to be higher in light of the government's agenda to address the housing shortfall, the 300,000 a year national target. But what exactly that will look like at that point is hard to know, because the government, in light of that target, is also updating this or reviewing their standard methodology. So because the methodology they've got at the moment does not meet the 300,000 target. So they are reviewing it. They've said they will let us know before they publish the next population projections what that calculation is going to look like. But at the moment we can only guess whether there's going to be an additional increase on whatever that figure is. So it's very difficult to say at the moment.
Thank you, Joanne. Do you have a supplementary, Councillor Harvey? No, okay. So, Councillor Rattigan.
Thank you. Councillor Harvey, just so as you are aware, I am going to see the Minister shortly on the subject of the 300,000 figure. I do not believe that is a figure that is sustainable, and it would obviously have major implications for failing to meet a target that is a set number. So I will be pressing him on build quality, place shaping and making, the quality of the environment that these houses are built in, so as we're looking to raise the standard, not raise the number. Because on the current projections, we might get to 240, but that'd be a 20% loss of face, let's say. So I would encourage them to rid the figure in the same way as the immigration target was missed and they got flack for that. I would rather see an emphasis on quality building of quality places for the future, but just so as you are aware that we are making the right representations at the right places.
Thank you, Councillor Rattigan. Councillor George.
Thank you. Firstly, excellent piece of work. Thank you. And I know the local plan is always a difficult document to get through and takes a lot of thought. I'm particularly interested here in following on from Ken's remarks, basically about the balance between numbers and the environment and the quality of life and everything is a tough one. Now, I'm very well aware that there's certain areas of the borough that are particularly susceptible to, for example, pollution and traffic issues and things like that, where ultimately, if we're going to significantly contribute in terms of numbers and houses, we're going to have some mitigation put in place to enable us to do that. There's probably no doubt about that. I'm just wondering, the trouble we've got is that often the mitigation process isn't controlled by this borough. It's controlled by, for example, the water companies and their budgetary processes, and Hampshire County Council in terms of traffic and everything else. Can I ask, to what extent are we able, and how are we able to really influence these processes to enable us to open up some of these areas for development?
As you said, I mean, they're key partners in this, very much so, and we'll be going on a journey with those people right from the off, really. To support the plan, there will be a lot of evidence-based work that goes on in partnership with relevant water authorities, for example, Hampshire County Council through highway studies. So we'll be doing infrastructure studies, highway works, all sorts of things. Shortly we'll be due to commission water cycle study, where we'll be working in partnership with the Environment Agency, the water companies and other interested bodies to look at exactly that kind of thing, the impact of development on our waterways. We'll do the same with highways, we'll do the same with infrastructure provision, so we will be looking at all of those aspects through the process.
Thank you. I think I understand that, and in fact you sent me a copy of the water cycle study and everything else, which is very good. But at the end of the day, this all comes down to timing, and we've got 3 years fundamentally to get this plan made, I guess, to meet the 5-year target. We're not going to get major infrastructure projects in place and completed within 5 years to enable us to do this sort of thing. I'm just wondering, how quickly can we push these things forward to open up these areas so it does enable us to it? And it really comes down to timing, because without the infrastructure in place, we're going to have major impacts from that.
To give Joe a break from the answers, I think that's a really important point. I suppose the reality is that you can't have all the infrastructure in place at the beginning of the local plan process, but what you need to do is make sure that during the delivery of the local plan, it will be up to 2038, there's a clear infrastructure plan which seeks to ensure that, as far as we can, the infrastructure needed to support new development takes place alongside it. And I think in part that's a reality, that a significant portion of that infrastructure will be paid for and provided directly by developers, albeit we'll want to have fairly in-depth conversations with all the infrastructure providers, the local enterprise partnership, to make sure that they provide the support which we need. I think the key point is the infrastructure can't happen at the outset. It has to be alongside the local plan as it's delivered through the local plan period.
Thank you, Matthew. Councillor Rattigan.
I just want you to be assured that I am having meetings with the LEP. I had one yesterday to discuss the long-term plan for the borough, to make them aware that we will have requirements for funding to look at our infrastructure, to work with partners to make sure that we don't not just have a local offering, even a regional offering, but a national offering, as perhaps we have free ports down towards Portsmouth and Southampton, and or we have a different linkage into airports and everything else. So they are aware of our aspirations and the need for us to combine infrastructure with our local plan and our ambitions.
Thank you, Councillor Rettigan. Just before we move on to the Labour Group questions, I would just like to add a question in for myself, really. One of the rare questions that I will be putting tonight. And really, could you please give us an idea about, with the local plan review, how much or how little do we actually have to review? Okay, because this could be a really big piece of work, okay, which needs pulling out, or is it a question of looking at all the policies and deciding which ones work and which ones are future-proofed and which ones we can live with to last, I don't know, 5 years down the line, which is ready for another one, and then moving on to the various policies that aren't fit for purpose and we need to do something about to get them fit for purpose. So I'm just wondering whether you could shed any light on that, please.
I think it's safe to say that it'll be a significant piece of work moving forward, which will take a lot of time and effort. Yeah, as I said at the beginning, a lot of the plan remains fit for purpose. A lot of the policies probably need to be tweaked a bit to make sure they're in line with national guidance, but many of them are probably fine as they are. As a legal requirement, we need to do a certain amount of work to justify that they are still fit for purpose for when that 5-year deadline comes in. So we need to do a certain amount of evidence-based work, etc., to justify keeping certain policies. For those that are out of date or that we choose to review, there will be a lot more work. And any policy that you update, you have to go through a standard kind of procedure with a local plan. And by nature, a local plan is a long process. It has a number of statutory stages of consultation, examination. So that all takes time. So to update even a single policy, you need to go through that whole process. I think probably perhaps the most time-consuming element for us and the largest thing to grapple with is the fact that we're looking at growth over a longer time period. So we will be looking at additional growth. So the implications of that, obviously, in terms of new allocations for housing, employment, and the impacts that that has in all ways, is a lot of work. So it's significant in that way.
Thank you. I'd now like to bring Councillor Gary Watts, please.
I just looked at it. It was in the point of page 12 when it was talking about since adoption. So since adoption of the review will be 16 years. That's why it's been extended to 2038. Is my interpretation correct of that? Because it was adopted in 2016.
I'm not sure which bit you're referring to in the actual report itself, but it's 15 years from adoption of the new plan. Yeah. So the existing plan runs to 2029. Yeah, say we adopt it in 2023, it would have to be 15 years from then. Yeah.
So I've got a number of questions. So where we're extending it, the plan, we have to identify new sites. With our difficulty in getting our 5-year land supply, with our inability to deliver many down, these sites are now going to be available to developers. And the likely thing is where we haven't got the 5-year land supply, they're going to be built out of phase. Development control will be powerless to stop it. Is that a good thing? I don't think that is a particularly good thing, that it should be extended to 2038 when we haven't got a 5-year land supply.
Just to give you some sense that we are trying our very best to narrow that gap on our 5-year land supply. It will not be a free-for-all. I'm very convinced that that's not what will happen in the borough. We are delivering more houses than our set number now. This year will be something like 1,200 or 850 wish. But you are correct. We have not done the right job in terms of delivery on some of our bigger housing. And this is a constant conversation I have with our planners, but it's also a constant conversation I have with developers to see how quickly they can bring forward some of these plans. And that has meant that I've seen a number of them, including Bloor Homes for their golf club site, and I expect that application to be in a better shape than it was presented previously. That has some of the natural concerns of the SPD within that, to strengthen some of the needs of the environment, but also the needs of the people who are surrounding that allocation. I promise you, I will be doing everything to ensure that the 5-year land supply is met and continues to be met over the longer term. You need to know that I don't like the idea of a free-for-all, where people are putting in applications where we don't have a protection under that. The Goddard's appeal, which will be a few weeks away, will give us some certainty as to what other people think of what we've done so far, and obviously that will have a large implication on us as a borough. But rest assured that I don't want some Wild West in terms of development within this borough.
Is it a supplementary, Gary?
I'm reassured to hear that, but nobody in this council wants a Wild West free-for-all. But the reality is, we've already had it in the Hatch Warren area. We had Hanson Fields and Kennel Farm were built outside the plan, and we had no control, and they were lost on appeal. And I believe there's other sites the other side of the town that was exactly the same. So that's the reality. I mean, this plan's been adopted since 2016, and here we are approaching 2020, and Manydown is nowhere to be seen. You know, officers were brought in to deliver this, and they haven't delivered. You know, it's a poor show, quite frankly.
Thank you. Okay. The next one is Councillor Aura James.
Thank you. I've got lots of comments and questions. One if I can start on number 1 in relation to housing and housing mix. Can I just ask, in relation to that review, you talk about a prescriptive housing mix policy could be introduced. Quite like to understand what you mean by that. Maybe I also want to talk about supported housing. I mean, we're not going to get any funding in relation to supported housing in the future, or very limited from the county. How are we going to take forward supported housing in the local plan, and what will that look like? I also want us, as part of that, to look at and to review the 100% flatted development policy, and particularly in light that there is no seal with 100% flatted development. I think that's something that we must look at. But also, I think that policy is in just encouraging flatted development. The other part, as well as that housing mix, will there be a survey that we do in relation to that will inform the housing mix policy? And I'll say here, I know it's going to start as a journey to scrutiny this month, but I want us, as part of the local plan, to look at our policy on 2-bedroom flats above ground floor, and should we be building 2-bedroom flats above ground floor that is housing families. And I want us to review that, and as part of that housing mix survey, we will be identifying how many families are living in flatted development above ground floor. And I think that's it. Oh, the other bit in relation to housing mix, I don't think there's any mention anywhere about rural. Is that going to be part of the housing mix? That's on the housing mix. Shall I carry on to the next, or shall we leave it at that and then come back? It's up to you.
If I can come back to you after we've had an answer to that comprehensive list of questions. I just want to make sure we get everything captured, that's all. Okay.
Okay, I'll try and pick up all the points. In supporting the next local plan, we'll be producing a new strategic housing market assessment, which will look at the needs going forward, and as part of that will provide the evidence base for what type of housing we're going to need in the borough going forward. So it's going to look at the forecast demographic change. We can anticipate there'll be an ageing population, how household structures will change and so forth, and indicate the type of homes that will be required. So in terms of the reference here to a more prescriptive housing mix policy, that refers to the fact that in the local plan at the moment, policy CN3 is quite high level. It sets criteria that can be considered to inform a housing mix, but it doesn't actually set any clear lines in the sand about what we need delivered to meet our needs. And so what we've tried to do is we put that in a supplementary planning document called the Housing SPD, was adopted last year. So an option that we could do is to strengthen the approach to housing mix through the local plan, which will give the development managing officers more teeth in those negotiations with developers. And there's lots of ways we can look at that. We can think about, is it a blanket housing mix, or are there particular needs in rural areas? Are there particular needs in some areas rather than others? We can think about, as you were alluding to, the difference between market housing needs and affordable housing needs, and how we reflect those two. So that's going to be an ongoing piece of work, and provide one of the foundations for the local plan. And another thing that the SHMA is going to do is look at older persons' needs and the needs of people with disabilities, and that can support various different policy interventions. One of those could, for example, be requiring a greater proportion of homes to be adaptable and meet people's accessibility needs. But again, that's something that will move forward through the evidence base, and hopefully allow us to develop policies from.
It was basically a question in relation to 100% flatted accommodation and sill. Okay, was one of the questions.
Which policy are you referring to as encourages 100% flatted? So it's PD rights is more the issue.
Councillor Harvey.
The policy at the moment is a developer can come forward with a 100% flatted development and get out of delivering sill. And we're seeing that more and more in order that they can get out of sill. But the consequences of a 100% flatted development in the current policy framework, and this picks up Ken's point about quality, is that it's driving down quality development because of what they're doing. So there's a need to review the policy and the consequences of it.
Is it more our approach to sill? So
Yeah,
as
it's more a sill. Yes.
as part of
Yes.
as
Yeah.
part of the review, we will be relooking at sill
Okay.
as a result of that.
Just-
so
just
that
keep
will
s-
be
just-
no.
No.
It's a separate document that came afterwards with sill, but we will look at it as part of that process. Yeah.
Okay, just to keep some order to the meeting, I know that Councillor Cubitt wanted to speak to the points that were being answered by Joe there.
Just so we don't double up, I'm looking at CN3 and I'm looking at CN4, and we spent a lot of time on this local plan, and I don't think that the failures relate to this. If we have failures, it's our officers imposing the requirements that we have already required in our plan of the developers. And you make a reference in your paper that on the annual monitoring report of 2018, most of them were fit for purpose. So in relation specifically, and that's why I wanted to interject, Councillor James's reference to CN3 and CN4, where is it failing at the moment that we're not getting developers producing and providing what we explicitly and specifically wanted as councillors when we drafted this plan in relation to the SHMA assessments that were identified in relation to elderly people in particular, and also young parents with kids?
I suppose it's the opportunity to make CN3 and CN4 more prescriptive, and to state more clearly precisely what we want in terms of what the actual mix of housing should be. Because, for example, CN3 talks about a mix of a range of house types to address local requirements. But if we can be more explicit in the plan itself and say what those local requirements are and how we expect them to be met, that strengthens the local planning authority's position in those discussions.
Can you explain more what you mean?
Well, for example, the housing SPD has a chapter on housing mix within it. The housing SPD is, I say, just an SPD, so it doesn't carry the weight of the local plan policy in determining planning applications. But the housing SPD sets out quite clearly, I think it is, that no more than 35% of market dwellings will be 4 bedrooms or more. So it's introducing a little bit more, the opportunity to be a bit more prescriptive in a local plan to provide some more teeth to, if that's what we're seeking, to ensure that that's what developers provide.
Sorry, so we can just clarify this. So what you're looking to do, okay, in CN3, CN4, is introduce, some of the housing SPD wording into the policy, okay, to strengthen the plan. Is that correct? Thank you. Okay, Councillor Harvey.
Just specifically on that point, I guess the question is a train of thought that says if current policy enables a developer to propose a 100% flatted development, which they can, and we allow that, and the result of that then is they don't pay SIL, but the result of that is it has a number of implications, then I really do support the bringing in of that prescriptive policy that we can then prevent the 100% flatted development in the first place. Because I think that's at the root of where, and in particular it's very sad because the example that we have to point is one of our housing providers doing that, which we found very disappointing. But it's not even a private developer proposing that, that's one of our own housing providers proposing that. So in that sense it was very disappointing to see them trying to get out of delivering SIL on quite a constrained site, let alone the Section 106. And here we are talking about this in this way. So I think, yeah, I really do personally, I think the Labour group would very much support that actually in terms of bringing those policies into policy. May I ask a couple of questions around the bits that are on here? And again, tell me to shut up and we'll come back in these bits to it as and when. Really thinking about the housing numbers figure and picking up where the leader left off, I think there is a really strong argument that given the current position of the construction industry, where we're seeing a serious skills shortage in terms of a workforce, we're seeing, for example, putting it in brass tacks, a bricks shortage. They physically can't get the bricks to build the houses in the first place. There's a serious land supply issue associated with those developers that are building out their land stock and those that are sitting on their land stock, and the implications of that in terms of who owns what, where in the borough, so that it's not balanced, it's not in any way, shape or form seeing some sense of regularity of delivery. We've got significant growth that we have already taken. That's placed huge pressure on our existing infrastructure, let alone the infrastructure that's currently going in. So there's really big stress on existing communities, and I know that's nothing that none of us don't already know. We know that. So I think the housing policy number, and the Labour group feel very strongly about this, we want to see that 850 figure driven down. We really do. We think there should be a much, much reduced housing figure as a target, because we cannot service that housing figure. We can't genuinely deliver that number of homes and expect the quality and expect the life that we want people to have available to them to be in any way the way we would like it. And I think that housing figure of anything north of 850 is going to present real issues of challenge to the borough. And that for us is a major problem. It's a major obstacle now. It really, really is. So I don't know how we square that circle, and you're right, I think, Ken going off to government to say, look, this is the score really, this is what we're facing, is a hugely important conversation. But if they stick to the 300,000 figure, and if they revise the methodology accordingly, then what Joe has said, and I understand that from a professional officer's point of view, you see that 955 figure perhaps going even further north, perhaps, I don't know. But anything north of 1,000 would be shocking, because we've never been there. And while we're only delivering 1,200 this year, that is set against the 850 figure overall. That's just this year. It will tail off later in the plan. So I think that's a really massive part of this review, and it's a dangerous part of the review because it does leave us vulnerable when sites come forward, when developers try and bring them forward. So I think squaring that circle as part of the review and giving us strength, as Ken's already alluded to, I think is pretty important. On the employment land, could I ask, in terms of officers, we've identified that we need employment land, and we've also identified employment land that we're losing. So we're already seeing employment areas that have been designated as no longer employment, and we can give them up for residential. Could the local plan review say, actually, having reviewed the situation, we no longer believe that you could lose that employment land, and we're going to redesignate that employment land as employment land, if it already hasn't been lost? Could we save it in that context of a local plan review? In terms of the station approach and Basing View, that's a really good idea. I think incorporating the station approach as part of the Basing View policy would be really, really good. That's different from extending the town centre footprint, which I think should stay as the town centre footprint. But the idea of extending the Basing View area as a policy area is sensible, because that brings into account, I think, the bus station, the station approach itself, but also that frontage of the malls and all those buildings associated with it, and that's a very logical thing to do. Could I ask in terms of the town centre, I think we really need to keep clarity and keep that focused on the town centre for the town centre's purposes, which is commercial in the prime, and I wouldn't want to see that diluted. I think that's absolutely critical. And also that the competition that the town centre faces, we have to be very vigilant to that, I think, and I'd like to see the policy at least give as much protection as we possibly can to the town centre and what it faces. Which begs the question then about the Chinham District Centre. Is there a particular reason why the Chinham District Centre is specifically listed, or am I just seeing that as an example? Because those other local district centres, I think, are going to come under pressure for no longer perhaps being solely focused on commercial. They may become under pressure for residential, which is an important point. The floor spaces argument from the government's technical housing standards would be really good to adopt that. I think that would be an exceptional step forward. And can I ask then...
Sorry, is this your final one?
No, but I'll stop there and you can
okay,
come back to me.
That'd be wonderful, because again, I've got to come back to Councillor Laura James. Okay. So we can... certainly, if you want to come in, Councillor Rattigan.
Just to give you some hope that skills will be available within the borough. I had a meeting with Anthony Bravo today to talk about BCOT's ability to upskill the labour force for construction. And you may or may not be aware, they've done a lot of work at Borden and Whitehill out there on the old army bases there, where they have a skills centre built with the help of the LEP. That is the view that we will have that sort of skills centre within Basingstoke, and certainly for the Manidown project. So although I obviously understand there are concerns that we don't have the right people to build the right houses, we are taking, as a borough, with our partners, a robust approach to that.
Can I thank Ken for that and just say I think that relationship with them, with the smaller to medium-sized house builders, to get that variety of stock and also the quality of stock is a really important link, and I think that's really good.
I agree. Okay, officers, can we answer the rest of Councillor Harvey's questions?
We'll accept them as a comment.
Yeah, most of them are comments. Just in terms of Chinham District Centre, there's not a particular reason. It's just that it's one of the main centres. I guess the fact that there may be change there over the course of the plan, so it's just keep that in mind.
We all know Talon own it and have put in a major consultation and wish to change it radically. So, I mean, it can't be a coincidence, no? You must be aware of that.
Yeah, which is why I alluded to the fact that will be subject to change as we're moving forward. So it's kind of to make the point that we will be looking at what's happening and whether we need to reflect that in changed boundaries, for example, and uses. So it's a live kind of issue.
Specifically, if I talk about this, because I've had conversations with the council in this regard, is that we have a wonderful centre with Festival Place and Odeon and cinemas. Now, Talon wanted a cinema centre there, and I said that was nuts, because we all know that all of the towns in the whole of the country are under huge pressure because of the changes in behaviours of consumers. So I don't mind, I mean, obviously you mentioning it in the paper, but I'm very nervous, and it goes back to the CN2 and the CN3 as well, is that we spend a lot of time writing this local plan, and it's very high level, and it's very specific, and it gives officers, and we spend a lot of time with the words, it gives the officers the armoury if you want to use it. Now, I don't quite understand why Matt's making references to the SPD not being strong enough, because I think that the SPD is fed into by the boxes that we wrote in the policies, which I think are strong enough. And I really feel that we open ourselves wide open to risks that are not necessary to be taken at this juncture on the areas where we don't have to open the Pandora's box, and we don't need to. We go into this room and there's all these doors, and each of the policies is a door, and I don't quite understand why we're suggesting that we open ourselves to risks that we don't need to take when we've already got extremely good policies that we as councillors and you as officers have spent an enormous amount of time in developing, that was supposed to apply out until 2029. And specifically with regards to Chinham, you know, I think it would be very dangerous for us to open up the Pandora's box with regards to the district centres, when we might be ending up cannibalising our centre, which is Festival Place and the leisure centre.
Thank you, Councillor Cupid. I'd like to bring on, I just want to run through the number of people I've got questions for. Obviously, Councillor Laura James and Councillor Harvey, I've got you on standby. But next I've got Councillor Conesco, then Councillor George, then Councillor Phillimore, then Councillor Watts, and then it's back to Councillor James, and then Councillor Harvey. Okay, and okay. You have spoken. Okay, but I'll add you to the end of the list there. Okay. Okay. So, Councillor Conesco.
Thank you, Chair. Can I ask a question about the neighbourhood plans, which is mentioned in paragraph 3.1? I just wanted to get a sense of how many have been created since the plan was originally launched, and sort of what success, what level of engagement have you had with those plans? And if I may, Chair, I'm not sure if I can also throw that question out to the councillors here, if any of their wards have had successful neighbourhood plans, because my experience certainly in Brighton Hill is that when we've tried to do something like this, engagement's been pretty low and nothing's really happened as a result. So I'm really keen to see what you think is happening and what potentially we can do to improve that within the next local plan.
Thank you, Councillor Conesco. Before you answer there, Joe, I'd just like to say that in my ward, okay, in Oakley and North Waltham, Oakley has an adopted local plan, which was adopted, I think it was about 5 years ago now, 4 or 5 years ago. Okay, it was certainly when I was first standing for election, and I've been elected councillor for 6 years now. And also North Waltham is well on the way with their neighbourhood plan, and I'm really proud to be working with both those parish councils. Now, before anybody else jumps in, okay, I will hand over to Joanne. Okay, so we have one in Basing, okay, one in Kingsclear, one in Whitchurch, okay. There is also one in Bramley as well. So there are a number around, okay. And if you're struggling, okay, go and speak to Councillor George, because he wrote the Whitchurch, or helped, okay, significantly put the Whitchurch, neighbourhood plan in place. So if we just hand over to Joanne so she can answer your question.
I think that response kind of answers your question to a large degree. But yes, the area has been very successful in terms of putting forward neighbourhood planning. Officers spent a lot of time working with communities, and communities have really taken on board the whole neighbourhood planning agenda and really run with it. It's more focused in the rural areas. We've got 9 made plans now across the borough. We've just had an examination on what will be the 10th, so we'll be having a referendum on that soon. And there are another 3 or 4 coming forward, which are getting more advanced as well. So it's still being kind of taken forward by communities. I think the local communities see it as a really successful tool. I mean, Councillor George will be able to comment further on that. They've been very successful in shaping development and also bringing forward new development, because we have a specific policy in the plan encouraging neighbourhood planning and also giving housing figures to certain areas. In all cases, in the named settlements, they've delivered on that plan and they've met the policy requirements. It's all very successful. We are now kind of almost moving to a period of review. Some of those early plans that you referred to are now looking at reviewing. They're incorporated into our annual monitoring process, so we are monitoring them annually alongside the parish and town councils as well, and they're looking at reviewing and tweaking plans and moving forward. So I think that will continue to be the case as we move forward.
Supplementary?
Yeah, to what extent do you think we've met our aspirations in terms of the neighbourhood plans in the more urban areas?
It is a lot more difficult in the urban areas because you don't have the same bodies, obviously, as the parish councils. You need the qualifying bodies to move forward. It is something that we've promoted, and we have talked to some local groups. But quite often they've tended to go down the community plan route rather than the neighbourhood planning route, which is a less onerous thing to do, and they've got specific issues that they want to look at, which doesn't necessarily fit with neighbourhood planning. It's more about community-led actions and things. So there's always the opportunity there to take things forward, and officers are always happy to speak to groups, but so far there haven't been really the drivers and the reasons why groups have taken it forward.
Thank you, Joanne. Okay, Councillor George, please.
Thank you. Sort of very timely on that one. I'll quickly speak on neighbourhood planning because you know, obviously I'm deeply involved in the Whitchurch one. And can I say that I felt that Basingstoke-on-Dean's team did a fantastic job on that, the support they gave and everything else, and made the whole process an absolutely excellent experience. It really was. Got a tremendous amount of support, and I think basically, not to blow the trumpet too hard, but I think you've probably got more neighbourhood plans per population than anywhere else in the country virtually in this area. I think we have, haven't we? Something like that. So you've done an absolute excellent job, and it's been a very good process for the team. The one thing I would ask, so, and I've got a little section down here, so I might as well go into that now, is one of the things I think we're now coming to a process where the first time you're delivering a local plan with neighbourhood plans in process, aren't you? You've got them in place. And I think one of the things that I would very much like to see, and you've touched on it a little bit here, but is what can you delegate to a neighbourhood plan to deliver, and what must you keep within the local plan, if you understand where I'm coming from. You know, there's a number of things there. You know, for example, we raised this issue here about town centres. Well, it's great, but 40% of our population doesn't live in Basingstoke. So what about the town centres for Whitchurch, Overton, and a few other places? Is this something that you want to take on in the local plan, or is it something that you can delegate to the neighbourhood plans as they're revised? Just a question, you know.
They're referred to.
They are indeed.
Yeah.
The plans are actually referred to, but it's the things you ask them to do. You know, neighbourhood plan when we did it in Whitchurch was primarily about housing delivery. Frankly, that's the primary strategic element of the whole thing. But we did take on employment as an additional one, and we took on a few other little bits. But for example, how about and you've mentioned again, healthcare issues. You know, if we're negotiating over housing delivery, why don't we have a doctor's surgery built in there, or a new nursery, and things like that? So it's important for us to know what you in the local plan at an early stage are thinking of delivering in those areas, and decide who is actually going to deliver it. Are we going to deliver the housing? You know, do you want us to deliver some more nursery places for preschool kids? You know, do you want us to deliver a new doctor's surgery and things like that? That's incredibly important for that conversation to take place, and for that to be clearly delegated, because one of the issues we had last time is the clear delegation, particularly when it came to planning matters and delivery. We've got to resolve that as well. So I think it's been an excellent exercise, I really do, but I would encourage us to think about what we can devolve down to these neighbourhood plans which are in place, and what needs to be within a local plan.
Thank you, Councillor George. Any comments?
I was just going to add that I agree with that. The local plan should cover the strategic high-level issues. As Richard's talking about, specific to local areas can come through neighbourhood planning. So it's really going to be on a case-by-case basis. Whitchurch is a good example of that it's probably delivered more than other neighbourhood plans has, given the nature of the area and what the needs were. And we can continue to have those discussions as we move forward.
One supplementary, Councillor George.
Very quickly, I'll be frank with you, the only negative thing we've had from the neighbourhood plan has been this issue about the timescales, 15-year plans, and in residents' perception, okay, we're going to need to deliver 350 houses or what have you within 15 years. The reality has been that in people's minds, that's not too bad, you know, that's only sort of 29 or 30 houses a year, or no trouble at all. The reality is we're going to be built out of those 350 in Whitchurch within the first 5 years, and now you're going to be coming back to us and say, oh, well, we need more. I would really like you to think about how this whole process is presented to the community, if you understand where I'm coming from. And you know, now quite rightly somebody from Whitchurch will say, oh, well, we've delivered our, you know, it goes up to 2029 or wherever it is, we've delivered our 350 houses, no more we've done our job. So I think the way that is presented is very important if it's not going to lose its credibility with the community. I really think so.
Thank you, Councillor George. So it's a question really of phasing. Okay. Okay. So let's move on. Councillor Phillimore.
Thanks very much, Chair. First of all, the Overton neighbourhood plan was the only thing that was a par with Brexit. 52 to 48, it was one of the closest ones in the country. But I'll go back to what the leaders tried to assure us. Sorry? Yeah. So I'm just coming back to the democratic point here, that I was against it, but in democracy, I'm supporting it, and you'll let me make my point, will you? So I'm just going to go back to what Councillor Rattigan said about assurances on housing numbers, because I'm afraid the developers' wagons are already circling in Overton. We were promised 150 houses. We've got Bargate coming to the Parish Council wanting to talk to the Parish Council about extra supply of houses on one of the sites. So where's your neighbourhood plan? We've got no housing supply. We weren't told in the neighbourhood plan that our surgeries would be merged with Kingsclear, and we weren't. And we were told, same as Councillor George said, that the development would be spread. It was in our neighbourhood plan. So all those points I'll make about the Overton neighbourhood plan. But going back to the local housing need in the report here, I'm really worried about this new standard method of calculating local housing need, because it's got no connection with the title in terms of no local judgment. So I mean, is it just going to be pro-rated across the country? 300,000 houses pro-rated across the country, or I mean, are we going to be pro-rated for that? I mean, that's a concern. I'll just go for two more points. One point on Joe made about local aspirations. There's no bigger local aspirations in the rural area is to live in the village or town where you were born, where you're educated, where you grew up. So I urge anybody that's looking at local aspirations in a update of this plan to look at this in terms of housing supply and who we're supplying the houses for. We don't want to be sleepy commuter villages where nothing goes on. So there is that. And the fourth bit is I would really like some advice or policy on strengthening our enforcement team, because I feel developers are walking all over us.
Thank you, Councillor Fillmore. So it's officers. Is it Joe first? Matthew, who wants to? Matthew.
Shall I do the last question first, which is the issue of enforcement? And I thought we did a very useful seminar with a workshop with members. I think it was early in the year around planning enforcement and about the tools that we can employ. And we took members through the enforcement policy which we've got. I think the challenge with enforcement, and it's not a local plan issue, it's a separate issue, is that the tools we've got are constrained by the nature of government legislation on planning and enforcement, and it is a process which encourages negotiation rather than and resolution rather than the sort of a punishment. And I know that's a frustration with councillors and other residents, but that's the reality of where we are. So as I say, it's not a local plan issue. We have got a policy, and there's no reason why at the appropriate time you can review the enforcement policy outside the local plan. But as I say, I think it's really important to recognise that we are constrained by the nature of government legislation and the powers we have and the powers we don't have in planning legislation.
So, sorry, just a quick interject there. In that case, is there any chance that we can change the name of the team from planning enforcement to maybe planning control, okay, or something along that, because, or conciliation, because it's the enforcement aspect. Okay. Thank you, Councillor Cubitt. Okay, let's have one meeting here. But if we can maybe think about maybe renaming that team, okay, so it's not, you know, enforcement, which conjures something in our minds, okay, rather than the reality of the situation. I think that would be helpful.
I could just answer that very quickly. Interesting that the name of the team is compliance team, which I think it reflects the nature of the council's policy and the sort of legal constraints we sit in. But I think we all share the frustration about some of our weaknesses around enforcement. But ultimately, we are constrained by government guidance. And personally, I think the enforcement team do a good job within the constraints which they're set.
Sorry, Matthew. It's actually the compliance team.
Yes.
Okay, do a very good job.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you. Thank you for pointing that out, Chair.
Okay, so Councillor Rattigan.
Councillor Phillimore, just to say to you that I will be approaching the numbers issue, hopefully from a position of strength, that we have delivered more than our number this year. Now, obviously, that does not help our 5-year land supply. So I will be asking for appropriate numbers, and certainly not to be given, should some areas fail in their numbering or whatever, be given their numbers too, which is a threat that is out there. Just to give you some feeling that we are moving forward in terms of delivery, in terms of quality of housing. I was with developers, I've said, and they've signed up to an agreement to use our building control rather than outsource things. So I think we can move the dial on quality. As for what we get given from central government, we will be trying, I promise you, but I cannot promise that it will be a number that satisfies Councillor Harvey's wish for a lower number than 850. But you can be sure that we will try to get an appropriate number for our borough. That means that people want to move into those houses, and there is an ability to build them. It's no point in having a planning permission if they're not going to build it out.
Councillor Fillmore, supplementary.
Yeah, I'm. Excuse me if I'm being a bit thick, but so we get a number for the borough, and then we argue between ourselves where they go, as per what we've done in the past. So, west of Basingstoke versus the east of Basingstoke, or whatever.
In terms of the new process, yes. I mean, in the old process, there was a lot more local judgment. You could take into account local housing needs and things like that into a lot more detail than you could now. The figure is imposed on us to some degree because it's based on population projections and affordability data, so it does vary across the country. It's not just split between the country. That's the figure at the moment. But as I said at the beginning, the government said they're going to change the methodology, potentially to increase the number to meet this 300,000 target. We don't know how they're going to do that, whether they are going to just proportion that across the country or how they're going to do it with, say, a percentage uplift, for example. We just don't know at the moment. But yeah, the approach is, and the government's intention is to increase certainty and to make it easier for local plan making, is to give us a figure, and that is very much our starting point. That's all the guidance is, that's what we must meet, unless there are particular circumstances why not. And then we need to go through the process of plan making to see whether there's any reasons why we can't take that figure, but that's where we have to start.
Thank you, Joe. Okay, so next on the list is Councillor Cubitt.
Yeah, hi. So thank you for that. So I've already made the point that I'm very apprehensive about us opening doors that we don't need to open. I would like us very much to focus, so my take home to fellow councillors is that we should only be focusing on those policies that are failing to meet. And what you were suggesting, Joanne, and slightly fills me with horror, is that you were going to reopen all these evidence-based documents that legitimise radical change and a complete change of our local plan, when our local plan was supposed to be for a set period. And I'm very apprehensive about that. In relation to, and I will really push back on that if I'm in this committee, in terms of the policies, because I think the policies are great. And I think there are certain words, for example, CN7 is a great example. I was involved in an inspector's appeal for a pub in my ward. And CN7, for example, the little words like or, I think originally were and the barristers representing the pub spent 6 hours almost talking about the word or. And I remembered constructing the words that we had in that policy box, and they were there with our purpose to protect our communities. And when we spend all that time, we're not lawyers by training, so therefore we don't focus on an officer changing the word from and to or. But I'm merely demonstrating to councillors that there is serious risks in us reopening this local plan, because an and might suddenly become an or, and then I'm suddenly in the chamber with some highfalutin barristers, and suddenly the ands become or. So in terms of concerns for our borough, water supply is more important than anything. And if there's any policy that I would and I don't know whether other councillors feel the same way, but and you made a reference to climate change. Well, the elephant in the room with regard to climate change and impact is population. And that can be micro-population and it can be macro-population. We know that one of the biggest reasons for the problems in this planet is the huge increase in the people. And the same applies in Basingstoke and Deane. If we increase perpetually the population that we have from what was 100,000 in 2000 to 185,000, and if we're then going to be building 1,000 houses per annum, like 1,200 this year, the increase in the water taken from our aquifers, which are all integrated, is so profound that I would really like that to be a high priority. And that's a room that I want you to open, a door I want you to open, and one that we really, really need to focus on. Because one of the other areas that I'm very, very concerned about and have been concerned about, and references were made, is to the monitoring. I'm not sure how strong our monitoring is, and I would like the Cabinet to certainly give us assurances that there is some way that we are certainly checking that the monitoring is being undertaken as is, committed to in our local plan as is. Because the references Councillor Phillimore makes to the failures on the part of the developers to honour the commitments that they had when we went through those extensive evidence-based documents on sustainability, where it was identified that XYZ site could be a strategic site, but provided that a primary school was provided, a secondary school was provided, a clinic was provided. And that's the basis on which we all went down this very lengthy, long journey, and that made huge intellectual sense. But then the reality is the houses get built, and all that argument that legitimised the reason for choosing that site on the proviso that all of those structures and services were provided, then it's just a waste of time. We're all wasting our time. And the quality of life of our residents gets further eroded. The water runs out, the clinics aren't there, the schools aren't there. And I have a huge problem with why we fail on that level. And then finally, EM10, which I have bored people with ad nauseum, but is very, very important. And you make a brief reference to it. But I would very, very much like, because we dropped a ball last time, we didn't make a reference in our local plan to the 2015 technical assessment, and that was a big ball. And I would like somehow, somewhere in our local plan, there to be a catch-all clause which makes a reference to any government legislation which further strengthens us must be assumed as if it were given to us in the local plan if it happens subsequently. And specifically the nationally described space standards of 2017. Perfect. Because we had lengthy emails on that with central government, and I was very unhappy with the reply that central government gave us on that, and I didn't understand why we couldn't incorporate it in our SPD, and I don't want to be left in a position where we can't include that going forward. So thank you very much.
Councillor Rattigan.
Thank you, Councillor Kubrick. Can I just confirm that it is the intention of this administration not to build any more slums? Spatial standards are really important. You'll have heard me banging on about that in DC. It is something that both the leader of the Labour group and myself have joined forces on many occasions in that committee, and you have my assurance we will be pushing damned hard to make sure that it's included in our local plan.
Thank you, Councillor Rattigan. Councillor Cubitt, I thought at one point you were going to go all UKIP on me for a moment. Okay, yeah. Talking about immigration. Okay, originally, yeah, population control.
Didn't mention immigration.
No, I beg your pardon. Okay, do you have a supplementary, or can we move on?
My final comment is, and this is to the government, is well, firstly, the Labour Party refused to give us a number at the last local plan, and before that, the number was always 1,200 from the Labour Party. We were 500. We've ended up at 850, and now they're saying sub 850.
One meeting.
But genuinely, I believe passionately, and our residents believe passionately in localism, and I don't think numbers being applied ad hoc and imposed upon us, like the South East. That I was actually giving you a compliment, not an insult, but it was a backhanded insult. Yeah, with Hazel Blears and her motorbike and the numbers that came out of her team. So we stood on a platform of localism, and that formula that I hope gets changed is based on affordability. And the reason why we have a problem is because we're building dormitory houses for people who are very wealthy, who aren't working in Basingstoke. So when you look at the salaries in Basingstoke and you look at the houses we're building, we're not building the houses for the people in Basingstoke. So we get given more houses to build. But if we don't stipulate that the houses that we build meet the salaries of the people in Basingstoke, we're like a rat on a wheel. And I just leave you with that.
Thank you, Councillor Hewitt.
Can I save you, Councillor Harvey, on this? Can I just confirm that through this local plan process, you will be better engaged with the administration? That is my sincere hope, and I am sure that that is important to you as well. And to Councillor Cubitt's point, much of what we do is about deliverability, so that will also be higher up the food chain on this local plan than it was previously.
Thank you, Councillor Ruttigan. I'd like to move back now to Councillor Laura James. I'm sorry it's been so long, but I did want to give other people a chance to speak. So
and it's given me more time to look at more that I want to say. So you've got.
You walked into that.
You really, yeah.
Well, in that case, shall I move on to somebody else and give you even more time?
I would like us to look at parking standards, and I know, like Olilie's saying, it's difficult to open these things up because you're opening yourself up. But the reality is, the sites that we've developed within this plan are now accessing the parking improvement scheme monies. So there's something wrong with our parking standards if new development is now taking that money where that was meant for areas like Brighton Hill, and it's meant for areas like Norden, but we've got new development is accessing that. So that's surely something's going wrong there. So I think that's really important that we maybe do a bit of scrutiny and look at what went wrong. Why is development not working and is having to access this money? And the other one, and I'm just trying to understand this, and I was just talking to Paul about it, is Chapel Gate, which is a site in our ward. Its school catchment is Oakridge School, but the school is full, and all of those people that are now moving into Chapel Gate are now being told that they have to go well out of area, and we're talking miles and miles. A lot of people on low income can't afford it for a lot of reasons. I know this schools aren't a local plan issue for us in their county, but how does county take on board our local plan? And I think it's, whether it's a piece of work is in this local plan, but I really feel that we need to look at this because we've now got new development just within, I'll just make it local to Norden, that is now not, the education is not going to be met within the local ward. And it's crazy. And when we challenge that, they say that they can go elsewhere. And so I just think it's something we need to think about. And I don't know if it's a local plan or it's how does county take on board our local plan in relation to other issues. The other one is in relation to quantum of open space. So obviously, since the last local plan, we've lost a lot of open space within wards. We need to do a piece of work to measure what we have got in wards and what it looks like, because I think that's important that we've got that information there. Climate change in relation to what we set as a full council in relation to the emergency and the target is, and I know it makes reference to it, but I think it's fundamental out of everything we're going to do in the future, is this local plan and all of the policies that sit underneath it actually going to address that target that we've set? And I think we really have to be robust about everything that sits under this local plan in relation to that strategy. So I want us to really examine that and look at what we can do differently. And I want us to be really progressive and really challenge ourselves on what we're doing at the moment. And in relation to the local plan, and this is me maybe a bit paranoid here, but number 6, could you tell me what it says? Appropriate in terms of planning policy and also strategic priorities. What does that mean? If you could just explain to me what you mean by that.
Thank you, Coach James. Just before we move on, I think I too, agree with you about the local green space infrastructure and policy, and I think it's vitally important that our residents do have green spaces that are easily accessed and make sure that we are one, fully compliant with current standards, and secondly, future-proofing our green spaces to any possible increase in standard. But officers, if
just in terms of number 6, where it talks about strategic priorities, it's really outside of planning policy, so it's what planning policy can do, but it was also picking up corporate kind of aspirations. So outside of planning is what that meant in terms of kind of other priorities.
That just makes me very fearful, really. And do we want that in there? And I'm fearful of that, and I can see us losing words like ancillary. So I don't, like Ollie, I don't want to go there if that is going to pick up the this council's political aspirations, because I can just see that we're going to lose that word ancillary, aren't we? So I'd rather. But we're talking about and in relation to open space, what I'm concerned about is when we see a development come forward, we're having what's the word when you have to meet it elsewhere? What's that? We're off-siting a lot of open space, but in Norden, we don't have any more open space to have. It's still the same amount, and we're reducing, but we're still offsetting. And I think maybe we need to review what's happening about the offsetting, because it's going down, and we'll just keep saying that we're going to improve, and they talk about as if we're improving the amount of open space we're going to get in Norden, but it's getting less and less and less. So I think it's an issue that we need to consider.
Certainly while the population density in Norden's going up and up and up. Okay, so I'd like to bring back Councillor Harvey, please.
Thanks, Chair. Just on that particular point, I think there's an important balance between corporate policies that, of course, the authority is going to pursue, set against the local plan that's meant to test those corporate policies via the policies that are in the local plan. And there's a really delicate balance to maintain there. So I would see policy 6 as being quite a test of that, and saying that in terms of the leisure part, the policy needs to stay exactly as it is written. The test of that is then how the corporate policy wants to deliver, or how it delivers what it wants, fine. But that's the test, isn't it, that needs to be had. And it's an important balance there. In terms of the localism point, I do think that's fair, and I know Ken's going to pick this up and probably push that back on government. I mean, to be fair, Tories introduced that in the 2010 manifesto. That's where it came from. Before Boris, before his dad, it was another MP in Henley who came up with that bright idea, to be fair. But I think the idea of localism needs to be developed beyond that now. This is nearly easily 10 years old as a philosophy, as an idea. So if governments are going to actually come back on localism, we need to think, and this is perfectly something for us perhaps to lead forward on, as to what we understand localism to mean in Basingstoke and Deane, in a way that we might lead this agenda now. They did then, that shaped policy nationally. There is nothing to stop us talking in terms of localism and what we see as it in terms of our local plan that could then hopefully promote national policy. That would be really good. In terms of some of the other bits of strengthening policy, and I guess this is where I agree with Anneli about not opening up Pandora's box, but strengthening, for example, the HMO policy. An example being where officers enforce a policy of a HMO. The HMO, in particular example, is, for example, the application is withdrawn or is rejected, and the developer in question then gets away with 3 people being in the property, because that's where national policy leads it, and then they rent it out to somebody that brings it in as a HMO, subcontracting. So as the developer, they don't have the problem because they've subcontracted it to who's now in the property. Our policy is silent in regard to how we deal with those issues. Now, whether that's a building control or an enforcement issue, I'll accept that, and it might well be. But the problem at the moment is our enforcement team, and they are good officers and they do a really good job, but they just don't have the toolbox.
Sorry,
they
Councillor
really
Harvey,
do not
it's
have the toolbox.
compliance team.
Compliance team. Yeah, that's my fault. I'm wrong. But in the context of it, we've really come up against this because they are themselves banging their head, thinking, well, national policy and actually local plan policy doesn't help them in that regard, dealing with that particular point. And because we're seeing a real significant growth in HMOs now, this is an issue for us in the urban area in particular. I'm sure it is in rural as well, but we're seeing it in the urban context. I think the biodiversity, the green infrastructure strategy and the other policies there have been some of the best things this council has done. The question is now, where do we take them to the next level? So, for example, in the local space bit, when Chapel Hill came forward for development, we, as with our officers, obviously looking at the planning application, in the round, in the balance, in the benefit, as Giorgio used to say, we allowed that developer to deliver less open space on site because they argued that off-site contributions on other open space areas could be enhanced. So we enhanced what already existed to cope with the population increase rather than actually increasing the amount of open space. Therefore, the density argument was really important. They could increase the density on the site, which they did. They're still doing that now because they're coming back for more. We aren't physically creating open space. And that's a really important, I don't know in terms of the local plan policy or the infrastructure strategy where you square that circle, but it's one that we need to really, really think about. And in terms of the infrastructure provision, how do you ensure that, for example, the Kennel Farm, Hampton Fields and golf course situation doesn't repeat itself, where you have several different sites where an element is delivered in one, not delivered in the other, might be compromised by the third? That level of the order of the section list of infrastructure is one thing, but programming it so the developer's feet is held to the fire is really, that's a toolbox for DC actually, I think, that perhaps is worth looking at. And again, it might not be in the local plan, that might be outside of that, but it's a consequence of the local plan. So it's just thinking through that, I think, in terms of the sequencing of when development comes forward, and then the programming, just respect what Ken's saying, in which case it needs to be picked up outside, when the sequence of development steps outside the sequence that we've got it in the local plan. Because we're thinking X is going to be delivered in so-so year, with Y piece of infrastructure, we suddenly find it being delivered 5 or 10 years earlier, and we're not seeing the infrastructure commensurate going with it, and that creates a real problem. And again, there are things that fall out of this in different areas. And finally, viability. If there's one area of policy I would love to get hold of and have a really good look at, is viability policy, so that we're clear and the developers are really, really clear. You talked about strengthening the housing mix policy. If we could really tighten up on the viability, that would be brilliant in terms of holding their feet to the fire.
Thank you, Councillor Harvey. Any comments? No? Okay. The next person I've got is Councillor Watts.
Thank you, Chair. This is more directed to the leader of the council, where he's going to have his meeting with the minister, whoever minister that is. And you mentioned slums. Since the coalition came in, we've had permitted developments, and in the town centre, they are slums. Or they're not. There certainly will be slums, and they're going to be housing problems. So they're not giving any money to the infrastructure. No seal, no 106, and below housing standards. So if you could bring that up with the minister, that would be greatly appreciated. The housing number, I mean, I've always advocated a higher number. But we can't sustain the 850 at the moment, all what everybody has said, healthcare, education, water, and we are struggling as a borough. So I support the leader of the Labour's group. We would look for a lower figure. The figure that's now coming out from government is now higher than the figure we had from the last Labour government, which was 950. I can't remember the 1250 figure, honestly. But yeah, no, I've never seen it written down. It's obviously it was a long time ago, and people's memories can change. So that's my thinking. Low as possible. We're changing policy on gypsies and travellers provision, where we're having 1 or 2 pictures on major sites. Are we looking to change that policy? I mean, I think there's been an upheaval over the golf club application, where we're looking to put more pictures up there. what is the change in policy likely to be?
Can I just say on the gypsies and travellers, sorry, just to, we have to review what is most appropriate at a time now, whether they're dispersed in our housing developments that come forward, or whether we can find a larger site that's more appropriate to gypsy travellers. But I think we have to keep an open mind, and we have to be mindful that that community have views of their own, which we need to feed into what we do as a borough. So I have to say it's a fluid process, but something that is, for lots of reasons, quite radioactive at this time. But we're aware we have a responsibility to that community, and we will discharge that as best we can.
Thank you, Councillor Rattigan. Okay, moving swiftly, I've got last three speakers. We've got Councillor George, Councillor Canesco, and Councillor Cubitt. So, Councillor George.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to move on, and I know Councillor James has mentioned this to a certain extent, but this whole area of fundamentally climate change and sustainability, because I think if you're looking at a big change, I think in emphasis on a macro scale, it's the one thing that we've really got to tackle. And I'm just interested in a few things. You know, what I find very difficult to understand, and I understand and possibly understand the reasons, but I'm going to ask the question, is we're still allowing houses to be built nowadays which are nowhere near carbon neutral, and yet by 2038 we're supposed to be carbon neutral. You know, we're just adding to the problem that we've got to tackle to get there in the end. So can I ask on that particular issue, I know, and we touched on this with the golf call SPD, but basically the situation is the planning legislation and what have you at the moment doesn't allow us to impose significant constraints on all, should we say, significant conditions on what can be built and whether we want solar panels on the roof and things like that. It's just not possible, I understand. Firstly, is that correct? And secondly, a secondary question here is I am very concerned about, again, a problem that we're creating for ourselves in the future, and it's the whole issue, I think, Councillor Oneley, Professor Oneley, I called you there, Councillor Oneley mentioned this, is one of water. Quality is an issue, but I think, frankly, we're expecting a little bit more winter rainfall anyway. This may help on there, but it's really one of quality. Now, we all understand the issues we had historically with the Loddon, and if you look at as I did a little while ago, look at the water cycle studies, it basically came down to said, well, we're not meeting the water quality standards, but if we build a few more houses and monitor it, we'll see where we go. And we know what happened. Now, my concern is that we've got particularly the Test River, we're already in the stage where the quality is declining, the groundwater is declining. Now, I know, unfortunately, it tends to be a strategy. Well, you allow it to decline a bit, and then it doesn't meet the standards, so you can not bother to worry too much about it. It's not a very positive approach. So could I ask that really the whole issue of the water quality in these rivers is urgently addressed, because the trouble is once it starts declining, you're never going to recover it. We're going to lose the Test, we're going to lose our trout and what have you. You're going to lose key parts, and you know, for Whitchurch the Test is the centre, the heart of the village, and the trout, you can see them off the bridge, it's wonderful. If we lose that, it's gone forever, and this is the real concern I've got. And if we don't act quickly and get the improvements in place to prevent that happening, and we build more housing, we're just going to lose that completely. And so the whole issue of sustainability in terms of climate and water quality for me, rather than water quantity, I think is important, and it is important. Can I just have your comments on that, please?
Shall I pick up some of the sort of initial points about climate change? I think it's fair to say probably that national planning policy isn't as ambitious or as free as we might like it to be in relation to what we can do in terms of setting zero carbon standards and so forth. But what we'll be doing through the local plan review is looking at all those sustainability issues, renewable energy, sustainable construction, and it's the place of the local plan to set those standards. So when we had the discussion about the golf course SPD, because of the particular sort of viability implications of these types of policies, that isn't the place where we could really push beyond. But through the local plan review, we have the opportunity to look at look at the art of the possible, and clearly with the climate change position the council's taken, clearly there's an appetite for us as officers to be doing that.
Just to add in terms of the water quality, you'll be aware, because you've seen the brief, that the consultants that we will be appointing in due course will be focusing on the test as well as the Loddon this time, to ensure that everything is given the proper consideration as we discussed.
Thank you very much. Okay, Councillor Canasco.
Thank you, Chair. The point I was going to make is that it's been picked up by Councillor George around the climate change and the scope we have to influence that. Because like you, I remember that conversation we had about the golf course SPD. I remember the question was around, I think the sentence in there was around to encourage developers to do something rather than make them do something. So it's encouraging to hear what you're saying there. And I guess just as a secondary point to Councillor Rattigan is potentially is this a conversation as well that you can have with the Secretary of State around making the national policy guidance more ambitious when it comes to climate change and incorporating that into local plans and the policy framework.
Councillor Rattigan.
I'm absolutely sure that with the climate change emergency being declared throughout government, both locally and nationally, I think that it will rise up the agenda, and I'm sure that we can slot into that.
Thank you. And finally, I've got Councillor Cubitt.
Yeah, so just going back to the very beginning, you, Joanne and Matthew, you were asked what was the minimum that we were required to do with regards to these 5-year plans. In the option analysis, because ultimately this paper is about us, the members, views being sought, and you imply that we could decide to proceed more slowly. And that's what it says on page 16. So we have an option. We can proceed more slowly, or we could just focus on what we have to focus as opposed to the nice to haves. And in terms of hierarchy, could you just talk me through what are the have to haves and then the nice to haves?
So we have to review all of the policies because the plan needs to be reviewed within that 5-year period. So by May 2021 we need to have published a document saying what the position is with each of the policies. Quite right with what you were saying before, in the fact that we don't have to update policies if we don't think there's a need, if you think they're working correctly. That's what members generally think, and monitoring shows that it's still in line with national government. We don't have to update them. I mean, this paper is really bringing that forward so we can discuss that, of whether we take things forward or not. So that's for us to do, but we need to do a certain amount of evidence-based work to prove that they are still working. So there is work to do in terms of reviewing. So that's kind of the first step that we have to review. That's a legal requirement, and we need to publish that information. In terms of what we then move forward with, that's kind of in our gift to some extent in terms of meeting local aspirations, how we want to strengthen the plan, how we want to move forward. The housing number is a slightly different issue in the fact that that number will come in. Come May 2021, that will be our new number. So the 850 at that point will be considered out of date, and whatever the standard methodology figure is at that point, that will be our new housing figure. So we need to be in a position that we're aware of that and we're ready to address that.
So all I would say is if we could have adherence to existing policies at the forefront of your department, and that we ensure that there is adherence to existing policy, that would be great. And just on the annual monitoring report of 2018, which we make a reference to, you said most of it looked great. So the indicators at the moment in terms of, as I said, if we do a hierarchy, as opposed to the nice to haves which we've debated this evening, in terms of hierarchy, which are the ones that are failing as per the annual monitoring report 2018 that are have to haves as opposed to nice to have?
In terms of the AMR monitoring, the things that were flagged up were the housing number, so the 5-year supply, gypsy and traveller provision and affordable housing. Those three were kind of flagged up. The only other one I recall was about design. So the design was read as well. So those were the ones that flagged up in terms of monitoring that we would need to pick up. But through this process, we need to consider whether policies need to be tweaked and updated in light of changed national guidance. So we have to go through that process anyway, because at that point, certain policies may be considered slightly out of date and will therefore have less weight when we're looking at applications. So we need to make sure the plan is up to date and in line with all of that.
Thank you so much. I think in terms of, I mean, I don't want to kind of put words in people's mouths, but I think that in terms of the figures that you're saying flagged up in the annual monitoring 2018, and additionally water, and you mentioned the design, that kind of pretty much focuses on all of the subjects that we here as members think are the most important, and the other ones we don't want them to consume the energy on the really important ones, which are those ones. So that's all I would say.
Thank you very much for summing up. Okay, that's wonderful. Okay, saves me a couple of seconds. Okay, and finally, Councillor Harvey.
A quick one, and I completely forgot about this, but it is important. Are officers aware, or should we be aware, of any threats in regard from our duty to cooperate? So in terms of Hart, Winchester, Test Valley, Berkshire and Wokingham, is there anything on the horizon as far as those authorities are concerned that would impact on us in this review?
Under the way that it works, in terms of the guidance now, we need to consider that. So if another or neighbouring authority came to us and said there was an issue, we would have to consider that and talk to them about it. From the duty cooperate meetings I've had so far, nothing has been raised, but I've only met with some of them, so we will see what happens. But from what I understand and all the information that we've had to date and where different authorities are in the plan making process, at the moment it doesn't seem like there's any issue. Obviously that will be under review depending on what happens with the standard methodology, etc. But that's the current position.
Thank you very much. Okay, members, if no one has any more questions, okay, I'd like to say thank you very much to officers and also to Councillor Cubitt for summing up for me. Okay, very succinctly. No, and I take it in that spirit. Okay, so I'd like to say thank you very much for officers for attending. Okay, and for staying past your working day. We will just look at the work plan, and you're more than welcome to stay. Okay. All right. Thank you very much, officers. Okay, committee. Just looking through at the work plan. Okay. We actually have a meeting on the 7th of November, okay, which we were going to look at the flatted development, okay, that you raised your work programme on. I'm still under discussion with Tristan and also Kate, okay, just to make sure that we can actually get everything covered in that. Okay, but also what I'd like to do is I'd like to put in, okay, an additional item where we have the task and finish group, okay, that's being headed by Councillor Janet Westbrook. Okay, we had a meeting the other day, and I think it would be worthwhile, you know, her bringing a report back to this committee so that we can discuss it and hopefully get it into a position where we can make a recommendation to cabinet. Okay, for people's knowledge, okay, it was to review the council motion on management companies and the non-adoption of roads and the environment and developments. Okay, so certainly.
I'm just sorry, I'm being a bit stupid, but I've got a provisional date and doesn't mention November.
There was nothing for November.
So it's cancelled?
Okay, no, I've just inserted it.
So you've
Okay.
just inserted it, but
Correct.
it's not here in front
No,
of us. Okay.
no. I said I want to bring, okay, to, okay, the meeting on 7th of November, you know, that particular item. So I think it'd be worthwhile, okay, and long overdue. Just to interject, we did have a very good cross-party meeting, okay, with officers, and and I'm very, very encouraged by the way forward on that particular point. But I don't want to steal any of Councillor Westbrook's thunder, okay, and so unfortunately you will have to wait till the 7th of November for a further update. In respect of that, we then have the 9th of January 2020, we have the Planning Authority Monitoring Report, okay, which Joe will be bringing back to us, okay, then we'll, to be confirmed is the Housing and Homeless Strategy with Kate and Tristram that I referred to earlier. I was looking to try and get that in for the 7th of November. If I can, I will still do that. However, okay, we do need to bear in mind the fact that there's a fair amount of upheaval and also some bits from scrutiny that need to be covered off first, okay, but I will look for that. And then also we have an update to the infrastructure delivery plan and proposals for SIL, which you know, I need to have a chat with Mark over. So I'll have a chat with Mark and see whether we can get that scheduled in as well. Okay, Councillor Harvey.
2 further points, if we can, Chair. Bearing in mind the good meeting that we did have in regard to the management companies, the same needs to be, we need to arrange that for the SS9, looking at that policy. That working group needs to do exactly the same. I think we can do that. And can I ask if you in separately, the Section 106 task and finish panel that's been established, will that come here? Is that the intention in terms of the parent committee? I know it's not on the list. Whose parent committee is that? Is that scrutiny's parent? Thank you. Sorry, that answers my question. Sorry, Seti. Thank you.
So yes, I agree with you with the other management committee to review the planning policy SS9. Okay, I think we actually had a eureka moment in the meeting. I was very pleased with the way it's gone, and if we can do that with the next one, then happy days. If it takes a bit longer to actually fulfil that, then you know I will happily do that. But you know, happy to do that. Okay, so Councillor Laura James.
Sorry, it's just, so the housing and homeless strategy that's coming forward, that's sort of a high-level document, but what the piece of work that I want to do is a separate piece of work to that, so it won't be included in that. It has to be separate to that, because also quite a lot of it won't relate just to housing. It will be about our planning policies as well. So it's a separate, it's not, so obviously it's going to scrutiny this month, looking at the housing allocation as part of the review. But it's not, it's separate to the housing strategy. It is a policy that sits under that, but I think it's a piece
Thank you, Councillor James. What I was actually doing, okay, was just trying to get it in, okay, and get the work done. Okay, so I'm still under discussion with Kate and Tristan. If I can get that work wound in, okay, with the other bits, then I would like to do that, because it gets it in, gets it done, and gets it in front of this committee so we can actually discuss it. Okay, and you know, again, you know, part of the issue is going to be is the fact that I don't really want them doing any work on that until the scrutiny committee has actually done their piece of work, because effectively what I want them to do is I want the scrutiny committee, of which I'm a member of, to actually scrutinise the current policy and see whether it needs adaptation, of which it will then be brought to this committee, so we can then discuss how it's moved forward. And after that, okay, I've also been looking for Kate to actually get you the information that you require, okay, and it's pushed all round the committee, so everybody has everything, okay, and that's what I'm trying to do. Okay, so I'd like to declare the meeting closed at 8:14. Thank you.